Hey guys, so I thought that I had unmuted my microphone from the little intro doohickey, and it decided that it was not unmuted there for a half a second. Sorry about the initial quiet. How y'all doing tonight? It's probably pretty late for most of you. You notice that my audio isn't quite up to par again. I decided to do the dumb today, and kind of halfway inspired by the fact that the soil that we've been trying to get delivered for my replacement garden boxes finally came in today after, well, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm sorry, but also there's an entire saga that I went through that I posted about over there regarding getting this dang compost soil mix delivered. I decided to go work out there and managed to royally piss my back off again. So apologies that things are a little bit echoey sounding. I'm trying to speak a little bit low and be a little bit close to the microphone, but unfortunately, y'all are stuck in my room. So, hi. Hello, Ikeda. Thank you so much for the first super chat. You wasted absolutely no time. It's all a government conspiracy. MK Ultra. Ha ha. That's horrible. It is brilliantly horrible. So, y'all might notice that I put shortage in quotes, and that was not a mistake. That's not to say that there isn't a shortage per se, but more that it's a manufactured crisis, so to say. Because what happened was, let's start at the beginning. Now, there's a bunch of links in the description, and they're not the only ones I'm going to reference, because I've actually had a couple people send me a few more since I started working on doing a little bit of research about this, since I've been kind of seeing posts about it. I'll be honest, I decided to do this particular topic when I saw the photograph that you saw in the thumbnail there of a bunch of plastic bags filled with gas. Now, regardless of whether the gas would or would not eat through those plastic bags, which a few people were talking about early on in the live chat when you all were hanging out with me a bit early. Thank you guys, by the way, for hanging out so early and being extremely dedicated fans. That's actually really freaking awesome, and I love, like, shooting the shit with the live chat while I'm getting everything all set up. But apart from that, there's also the problem that very, very flimsy containers. I don't know if you've ever tried storing even just garbage or items in plastic bags. It is very easy to puncture them. And if what you filled the plastic bag with happens to be an extremely flammable liquid that the slightest spark of, say, shutting a door could potentially ignite, and also the plastic bag is clear, and thereby the sun could hasten the degradation of the liquid that is stored therein, yeah, you're asking for problems. So, PSA, before I start talking about what led us to people doing these things, do not, I repeat, do not, if you do decide to panic buy anyway, fill plastic bags with gas. Just don't do it. It's bad. It is not a good idea, even if you're not worried about, like, the gas potentially eating through them. The slightest bit of puncturing could cause problems. The gas is going to degrade because it's not being stored in a way that's going to stop that from happening. And also, even if it does degrade, that doesn't mean it's not going to be flammable. It just means it won't be able to run your cars. So you're not going to do good for yourself. The problem is that it wasn't just one person who did this. It's so bad that the Consumer Protection Agency has had to issue several warnings to not put gasoline in containers that are not designed for gasoline. There have been reports of people putting it in Tupperware containers, plastic bags, paper bags, like storage containers, all kinds of things. Just don't put gas in anything other than a gas can or your tank. And better yet, if you don't need gas right now for your tank, just don't buy it until you do, because panic buying is causing the gas shortage. So let's talk a little bit about the history. Let's get into why people are freaking out. So, for any of you who live in the Southeast, I'm sure you've been hearing all about this, but there is a link down in the description. I have a number of different articles. The WCVB article is going to be the first one that I'm referencing. A little bit of a timeline. So Colonial Pipeline, which is one of the main, if not the main, gas supplier in the Southeast, got hacked on Friday. Yes, putting liquid in a paper bag. There are paper bags that have like wax linings in them to make them not liquid proof, but at least safer for things that might spill. Like, you know, if you like drop your milk and crack it or something, like why would you put milk in a paper bag? But that's beside your point. Like, let's assume you say have something in a glass bottle's cracked, or, you know, something's not sealed properly. The wax on the inside will keep it from destroying the paper bag. People have been putting gas in those. I don't know why. Yeah. I mean, when people get desperate, they're going to get creative, and getting creative is not always a positive thing. Like, when you're putting your own life at risk, that is not a positive thing. Yes, Aether Tales. I wish I was making that up, but I've read over 25 different articles from various news outlets, and that was one of the things that was listed. I wish I was making that up. So, yeah. Anyway, coming back to the history, let's talk about what led to this. So Colonial Pipeline got hacked. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the kind of hacking, they got a sort of blackmail hacked from a cyber group. Let's see if I can find the name again really quick. Because I've got the warning thing up here, and I've got the Colonials Restarting Operations article up. Let me see if I can find the actual name really quick. Here we go. A criminal group called Darkside attacked Colonial Pipeline. What they did was they got into their systems through some sort of backdoor, and they encrypted all of their distribution network systems. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what encryption does, you know, I know that a lot of people like to throw around encryption. Oh, hi, Nervardia. Thank you so much for your $2 Australian dollary-do super chats. Good choice, Ali. It was delicious. Nervardia, before I started my stream, texted me with I can't pick between two options on vacation food thing, and I gave a recommendation. And Lord Elantri says, this is way too late for me at 4 a.m., but I figure I should jump in and say thank you for all the hours of content you have that I've binged before going to bed. This is about what a DVD would cost, so it's worth to me. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, Darkside. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with what encryption is, basically what encryption does is it scrambles the data in such a way that without a key, you can't get access to it. Effectively, the keys are complex enough that you could try to run, say, a password unlocker millions upon millions of times, and you'd probably never get them. Encryption can be, if it's done right, it can be so unhackable back that even like companies and organizations like the FBI and Interpol might not be able to break into it. So having a major company having their systems hacked and encrypted is a pretty big deal. In fact, this sort of ransomware is becoming increasingly more common. But when you're talking about something like, say, a gas network, and you're talking about their distribution centers and their distribution and their pipeline and all the things that are regulating around that, there's a lot of damage that could be done by a hacker. Maybe not as much as, say, somebody hacking a public utilities company or something like that, but there's a lot of damage that can be done. So news outlets went out there. They talked about how because Colonial had been hacked, they were going to be suspending a lot of their distribution because they didn't have their systems up anymore. So there might be shortages. That was what was put out there. So what happened was just about everybody in the distribution area, a large percentage of the population in the distribution area, I'm not going to say everybody because I know there's people in my audience that are not out there doing this stuff, decided to flood gas stations with whatever containers they could find. And the consensus of all the articles that I've read is weeks or days worth of demand and purchasing being done over the course of hours. Basically, something like one of the articles was saying almost 25 to 30% of gas stations in certain areas, like Raleigh, I think it was almost 50%, are dry. Because people decided to go out with whatever containers they could find and buy as much gas as they could possibly hoard. And this created the shortage that may or may not have happened otherwise. Now, there's a lot of comparisons to the toilet paper shortage that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, because oh no, you need to limit your shopping, go out and buy all of the toilet paper ever. The ethos of panic buying drives me crazy. And there was somebody on Twitter that summed this up really well, but I'm going to try to give my own commentary on some of the things that they said and some of the feelings that I have about it, because, thank you so much, Akeda. It's amazing that major companies still don't take computer security seriously. I think they do, but I think the problem is that there's this balance that a lot of big companies have to strike between security and their own ability to update and manage their systems. If you get locked out of your system from a low employee or something and it's too secure, then you're screwed, kind of thing. Versus, having too many backdoors. And of course, if there's a backdoor that you can get into, that means somebody else can too. So there's a horrible balance, and I don't envy anybody working in cybersecurity, personally. So Rilla says, I was writing on eMonday, so I filled up at $3 a gallon. By the afternoon, they were sold out. Yep. So here's kind of my commentary on this. And I'm going to get into why panic buying is a whole problem in a bit. And we're going to get a little bit into why the panic buying created something that might not have existed later. And somebody earlier in the chat had said Colonial had restarted its operations, but warned that there were going to be a few more days for them to get distribution out there. That is true. I'm going to link that in the live chat. There's an article from NPR that declared that by 5 p.m. EST, they had started their operations again. So there's that. But here's the issue with the attitude that creates panic buying. Okay, there might be a shortage coming. That's where a lot of these ideas come from, right? Like, people are worried. You're going to have to, in the case of the COVID toilet paper thing, you're going to have to hunker down in your house for a little while, or there might be a shortage of gasoline. Instead of kind of leaning on and relying on each other and trusting each other's, trusting your neighbors and being a community, Americans especially, I know that this attitude exists elsewhere, but I live here and this is the culture that I'm surrounded by, have a tendency to be very much this attitude of the only things I have are the things that I can make away with in my hands or tuck under my arms or stick in my car. The only thing that I can rely on is myself and mine. And we have a tendency to not even rely on each other, as in our closest friends. People will buy massive numbers of things as though these sorts of shortages are going to drag on for years, and as though creating their own personal toilet paper castle in their homes is somehow going to protect them from whatever supply chain problems there might be. But nobody ever stops to consider why this might be a problem for other people. There is this thing that once I've got mine, that's all I need to worry about. And as a mutualist, as somebody who's a, dirty commie, as you guys know, this is an attitude that I can't fully comprehend. As a native, even, as an indigenous person, it's not an attitude I can fully comprehend. I've got mine, so screw you. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it also will often create a problem where one didn't exist. There was plenty of toilet paper that was available. Toilet paper is largely domestically manufactured, right? And there's plenty of gas currently that's available because the pandemic dropped demand so much because nobody was going anywhere, that it dropped demand so low that there's excessive amounts in storage at present. So why do people want to now build far more dangerous and flammable bags of gasoline castles? This does not make sense to me. But beyond that, it doesn't really help you either, because even if you could assume that the gas wasn't going to degrade, and even if you could assume that, all right, well, it's not going to eat through your plastic bags, let's pretend we live in a world where that's a little bit less dangerous than it actually is. How the hell are you going to get it into your car? Exactly. how many gas tanks worth are those bags that were loaded up into the back of that person's trunk? And if they do get punctured and blow their car up, well, I mean, that's going to be a lot more money than they would have saved on whatever shortage is coming, right? And your toilet paper castle, how long is it going to take for you, even as a family of four, to like use that up? So that doesn't really make sense. And I mean, like, yeah, at least toilet paper doesn't really spoil like gas does, but it doesn't make sense. So let's talk a little bit more about why these outages are getting worse. Because, North Carolina, I got the figure wrong. According to CNBC, as of the time on this posting is 2:41 Eastern Standard. It's another one of the link. It's a CNBC article. 65% of gas stations are out of gas. In South Carolina and Georgia, 43% of gas stations are dry. Virginia, 44% of gas stations are dry. Virginia, 44%. Let's see. South Carolina, 43. Let's see. Kentucky, 2%. They didn't get the run. Florida, 10%. Washington, D.C., 10%. Alabama, 7%. So the big thing is that there might have been a shortage within a few days to a week, depending on how long it took Colonial to get their shit to restart. And that would also have been enough time to potentially for gas stations to negotiate with their supply networks and potentially try to get things shipped, right? Because there's also the compounding issue of there's some new regulations around like drivers and driverly experience and needing to renew licenses and driver shortages. These are things that are compounding the issue with Colonial. But again, you're talking about a maybe within a few days to a week. Do you really need to go fill up bags and tubs on a maybe between a few days and a week? Especially if your car doesn't need to be filled up all that often or has a relatively small tank. Like, chances are you're going to be able to find a station when you're talking about a maybe. And according to the articles, Lucius, according to the articles, if it is $4 a gallon near your house, that is not being directly caused by these runs on the gas stations. According to at least 2 different articles that I read, the gas station price hikes that have been going on have been a natural sort of increase because of the increased demand that is starting to hit for the summer. They're normal increases. And due to relaxed regulations from the Obama era around gas station pricing and gas pricing. So most people, Carpathia says most people don't go through a tank every few days. Like, we have a Prius, and our Prius, we fill it up maybe once a week, if that. So, like, okay, you're worried about it. Go top your tank up. Don't fill up an entire, like, tub full. You know, don't go get your storage crate and try to fill it up with gas. Like, that does not make sense. Okay, Orcus, you know what? My husband wanted a hatchback. I wanted something that was gas efficient. We compromised. So, they need enough gas to get out of the southeast to get more gas. Exactly, Skylar. Exactly. So, let's talk a little bit more about how the panic buying kind of added to this. Because CNN had been putting out articles that there might be a nationwide gas shortage anyway because of lack of qualified drivers, which, you know, the solution to that, of course, would be to make driver training more accessible and to create programs to incentivize getting truck drivers trained, because the training programs don't take all that long. But instead, the media is like, hey, let's send everybody into a sensation. This will get clicks. You know, I might cite mainstream media fairly frequently as a more reliable news source, but that doesn't mean they're not yellow and sensationalist. Like, even the more progressive ones, there's still problems with them. So, looking at the CNBC article again, we have the national average for a gallon of gas topped $3 on Wednesday for the first time in nearly 7 years. The uptick in prices is more acute in states including Georgia and Virginia, where fuel is running short. The Colonial Pipeline is crucial to the country's energy business, but experts are quick to note that it should remain closed for a longer period of time. There are alternatives. Fuel could be shipped by rail or truck. It could also be imported from Europe. Additionally, the Jones Act could be waived to ease delivery concerns. Officials say Tuesday. The Jones Act, by the way, requires that any ship that's transporting fuel overseas to the United States must be manufactured in the United States. That's the Jones Act. They're trying to pressure the Biden administration to ease the Jones Act right now. However, with Colonial restarting its operations, that might not be necessary. So let's see. Fuel could be shipped by rail or truck. Officials said Tuesday that there have been no calls to waive the act, which requires goods transported between the U.S. ports be on U.S. flagged ships. So there we go. It has to be U.S. goods need to be, like specifically gasoline especially, need to be on U.S. ships. They're trying to push the Biden administration toward this. So in terms of the demand for gasoline, if people hadn't run to go panic buying and filling plastic bags and all these other things, this might have dragged on for a week or two, maybe a few days. There might have been a couple days where a few people here and there might have had a harder time, but much like the toilet paper shortage, this got significantly worse because people refused to consider any sort of mutualist considerations. When you pair that with the fact that Americans love our gas-guzzling monsters, you can see why this situation becomes an issue. This is where panic buying doesn't make a lot of sense as a defense for these sorts of issues, right? Like, I could understand going out and making sure you have a pack if you were running low when you find out there's a run on toilet paper, but grabbing multiple bags worth or multiple containers, I don't understand why this stockpiling behavior, why this distrust of the community has become so prevalent. It's baffling to me. It really is. And I'm sorry if that's not as entertaining of content as you were hoping for around this issue. Again, I'm trying to be very educational, but as somebody who is very far on the left, this idea of particularly mutual aid, of you run out of gas and maybe your neighbor has a gallon and you can get some from them. Or, like maybe somebody who knows a company that has gas when all of the other nearby stations are dry, right? This idea of helping each other, like, hey, can I borrow a cup of toilet paper as the joke went? It's basically been lost. Like, how many of us even know the names of most of our neighbors? So, yeah, and it is a side effect, Orcus, of Protestant individuality. Everybody got it before me last time. I need to get more and sooner to avoid what happened last time. Well, the problem is, though, again, if you're talking about that on an individual scale, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But when all of your neighbors are thinking the same damn way, and there's only a finite number of stores, and the distribution networks are being taxed, Rilla's husband is a trucker, and back in the olden days of the channel that shall not be named, I actually did an interview with him a while back, talking about during the pandemic, and I know that I keep coming back to this, but it's the same thing. It's exactly the same behavior. People were afraid, for some god's forsaken reason, people back then thought that toilet paper was imported from overseas primarily, when it's not, but anyway. So they ran on the stores. And in this case, it's, okay, the Colonial Pipeline got shut down, but we don't know how long it's going to be down, and it's already starting to restart operations. So this panic run, all these people have just wasted mass amounts of their money. The same way that the people who mass bought toilet paper ended up wasting mass amounts of their money. And I mean, great, now you've got your toilet paper castle. Now you've got your very, very dangerous, flammable, potentially pokeable fort of liquid that could very much destroy the rest of the money you've spent on anything that you own. But apart from that, what security does rushing to get a particular product actually give you? Have we gotten to the point where we've lost trust in the supply networks and things, which think about this genuinely. What good would it do for a multinational corporation to just leave its distribution networks hanging high and dry for potentially months on end, unable to sell anything and make a profit? Like, the end distributors, the gas stations, they're going to make bank off of that. But the distributor that got hacked by not taking care of it, what benefit is that going to give them? What benefit would it give to domestic manufacturers of toilet paper to withhold supply? They can't charge more to their end distributors for fear of competition, because that still exists. Like, they can't charge more by withholding supply. Not very easily, not because of oligopoly laws. The FTC would get involved with that pretty damn quick, right? So you have this conspiratorial mindset of this is going to last a long freaking time, this fear-based, like, for lack of a better way to put it, I hate the term reptile brain, but this, like, ancient brain arousal, this fear instinct of I've got to protect me and mine. But remember that also isn't necessarily something that is as inherent to people as one would think. This is something that we're taught culturally. We are taught culturally that nobody's going to look out for you. As children, like very young children, most kids with any sort of healthy upbringing naturally are inclined to share. Humans have been communal for most of our existence, particularly when you're talking about any sort of hunter-gathering societies or even early agricultural societies. There is an instinct, especially once you started seeing class stratifications among the lower classes, to understand that what is mine is yours and what is yours is mine. In a lot of societies that are pre-industrial, you saw this, in my tribe, if somebody needed a longhouse, the tribe would come together to take care of it. You take care of the old and the sick. You take care of the infirm. They're still people. And yet these able-bodied people with family and friends that they ostensibly care about are rushing to the bastions of capitalism, who ultimately the fat cats that own these stations are going to be the only ones that benefit from their panic dollars, right? Because they can keep hiking and hiking and hiking. The ones that still have gas, they can keep hiking those prices, which of course is going to be an incentive for people to stop this behavior. It's a shitty incentive for anybody who genuinely needs a tank of gas. But there's now the only people that this is going to benefit is them, because you've got a bunch of stuff that's going to degrade, and you've also sort of added to this attitude that we have culturally that we can't rely on each other. And that's incredibly distressing. Like, as a society, we live in a society, right? As a society, what does that say about our potential future? Marx wrote about the alienation from labor. And again, we're not going to go all the way. I'm not going to fly the whole, sickle and star, all that stuff, right? Like, but talking a little bit about class theory. When you're talking about your connection to your labor, what you feel you're contributing to society. The society in which we live, many of us feel like interchangeable cogs in the machine. And the Industrial Revolution has a lot to do about that, right? Like, if you're a checker at a grocery store or even somebody in a manufacturing plant that does a specific task, it's relatively simple to train for your position. You might not feel like you are an integral part of your company or your community. And it wasn't like that for most of history. Most people's last names are things like Smith or Shoemaker, or, you sometimes see XYZ son, John's son of John. But Fisher, Weaver, Shoemaker, Smith, these very generic last names exist for a reason. We had positions in society. And the disconnection that a lot of us feel from that position in society where you no longer feel like you're contributing something, that might be part of that distrust, is that none of us feel like we're significant enough for anybody else to want us to be saved. But we're also so selfish that we don't stop to think about who else might need to be saved unless we know them personally. And we also live in a society where knowing your neighbors personally, especially for those of us who are pagans and the like, might carry some level of risk. Yeah, Cooper, Miller, Baker, etc. Last names. Like, it's infuriating. And the problem is that panic buying is emblematic of that attitude of, I get mine and you can eat shit. And apart from trying to form sort of little islands, which is a metaphor that I use in this week's video, by the way, the one that's coming out tomorrow. And apart from trying to form little islands of community where we support one another, I don't really have much of a solution for a systemic issue apart from, well, like redoing large parts of the system. But in this case, this is a direct result of capitalism, because when you think about it, capitalism itself, the idea of supply and demand and scarcity, it is so intrinsically woven into our skin and bones as Americans, as people who live in this system, that even though this system overproduces by miles the things that we need, if your neighbor bought it, you can't have it, because there's no way, your neighbor has no incentive to share with you. And in a capitalist society, that's considered an ideal. That's considered a virtue. But is it? Because the moment that I said that, I'm pretty sure that most of the folks in my audience just kind of recoiled a bit, like, no, that's wrong. Why would you discount somebody else's needs and feelings so easily? Because instinctively as humans, that's not how we think. There's this idea of survival of the fittest being an individual thing, but it's really not. Evolution is not an individual thing. Evolution is a change over time that happens because of reproductive success. But for a communal species, like humans are, and again, I know I'm speaking to a religious audience, but we are a communal species, right? Like, a large percentage of the folks that are hanging out in my chat right now are probably pagan, and most of us probably believe in evolution. We are a communal species. I've been watching documentaries on the Curiosity stream because I'm a big paleontology geek. It was my first major. I got partway into it before I realized I would never be able to get a job in my field. And, like, I didn't specialize in paleoanthropology at all, or Ice Age paleontology. I was far more interested in far earlier stuff. So every so often I'll watch documentaries on things like human evolution. And one of the things that scientists theorized might have been the reason why Homo sapiens might have triumphed over Neanderthalensis, even though we also interbred with them, right? Neanderthalensis, we have worldwide approximately 2 to 5% Neanderthal DNA. But one of the reasons why Homo sapiens might have ended up becoming a dominant species like we are is because of the fact that we are a communal species, because we instinctively band together in large groups and we work together to hunt and to fish and to take care of each other. So what kind of force does it take to retrain the basic instincts of a communal species to turn on each other and tear each other apart and to take more than is needed instinctively as the first response to a crisis? Because there have been many quotes that, like, hey, this, if aliens were to invade and there's this big external threat, then humanity would band together. But that doesn't seem to be the case, because let's face it, an alien came out of a forest somewhere, this virus, and humanity ate each other. And it takes a lot of work to get people to do that. It takes training basically from birth to get people to do that. It takes a lot of disconnection and dissatisfaction to override human instinct to the point where we turn on each other rather than cooperate as we've done for most of human history. For most of ape history, for that matter, because most apes are communal species. And Standell has a good point here. The survival of the fittest literally led us to communal actions. It's not just a fight against it, it's actually the definition of it. Sure, maybe the individual is weaker than we might be, but the community as a whole is stronger than we could possibly be if we were personally as strong as we could be. And that's absolutely true. This individualism, this idea of the individual unit as the most important unit in a community does not make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, and it sure as heck doesn't make a lot of sense from the standpoint of solving crises like this. It just doesn't. And yeah, individualism can be useful in some regards, in that personal fulfillment, once your basic needs are taken care of, can actually help advance the species, and it can also, be personally satisfying. But this idea of the individual above all else can become toxic. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for utilitarianism, the greatest good for all the time, because that can also become toxic very quickly. But there's a balance between the two, and we have swung so far over to the side of individualism that we literally, because of our selfish behavior, are creating panics and crises like this gas shortage, because we want to make sure that we get ours and can survive. And that's what happens when we're fighting over the crumbs that get cast off from the rich people's table. And living paycheck to paycheck absolutely will trigger this. Absolutely, it will. It could help explain some of the prevalence of depression. Some of it might also be, worker alienation. There's lots of different reasons why people are depressed and anxious. So let's come back to what's going on. What are the states doing? Currently, Virginia's governor has just declared a state of emergency due to the fuel shortages. Georgia, North Carolina, Florida also stepped in to ease supply concerns. The EPA issued an emergency fuel waiver. And you, individuals that might be in the Southeast, the best thing that you can do is top up your tank if you need to, if it's low. But otherwise, there needs to be at least some trust in the system and in each other. Because if we start hoarding, well, this is what happens. You end up with fuel supply shortages that are created exclusively from the very panic buying fear that is meant to prevent you personally from running out. So, to give you guys a little bit more background on the hack, by the way, because there is a little bit more that I was able to find. The Colonial Pipeline transports over 100 million gallons of gas. So this isn't an insignificant amount that just kind of got cut off. But the encryption encrypted pretty much all of their systems. And what was interesting was that they did have a backup prior to the encryption and were able to restart the systems within less than a week, it seems. Ty Firth, we are talking about how panic buying is an absolutely terrible idea, how we need to kind of rely on mutual aid, and also how panic buying literally created the crisis in the Southwest and the Southeast right now. Welcome. So, on the subject of unsafe practices, if you guys want, we can watch a little bit of cringe, because I found a clip on YouTube in one of the articles from the Washington Post that shows a woman putting gas into a plastic grocery bag. Like, not even a yard waste bag, which are the ones in my photo, a plastic grocery bag. Hoy. Coyote says, I desperately need sleep, but here's some money. Don't buy all the gas with it. Thank you so much, Coyote. Now, keep in mind, or Coyote. Sorry. I always have to remember Coyote. So, I don't actually live in the area that's affected. I'm hoping that somebody might come on later tonight, maybe not, that does. But I don't live in the area affected. But I do remember when we had gas shortages up here, and we did pretty much what everybody else, like what I just advised. We gassed up when we needed it. We were about halfway down our tank. We're like, all right, people are panic buying. Let's just gas up what we need right now. We're not going to buy a bunch of gas canisters. We're just going to gas up for what we need, and we'll trust that something's going to be done about it. And sure enough, something was. Because again, it is not in the best interest of state governors for their economies, of gas stations to keep out of gas, of even the pipelines themselves to not have supply. From a capitalistic standpoint, that does not make sense. Scarcity for basic needs that have inelastic demand, when panic buying makes it suddenly elastic, one of the things that I think a lot of people aren't considering on this also is that because gas can degrade so easily, you're ultimately hurting the environment a hell of a lot more too, because you now have these extremely flammable bags that you're going to have a very hard time explaining to a waste collection agency exactly why you have to give plastic bags full of very dangerous chemicals to them to dispose of. But also, if that degrades, you've now wasted a resource that we can't get back. Also. And you put it in your grocery bag. What? Hey, Variants. Welcome to the shit show. I'm kind of ranting a little bit about the ridiculousness of I'll get mine. Martine says, I live in North Carolina and I'm a delivery driver. I am fuming. But first off, thank you. Second, you absolutely have a right to be angry because, again, this is artificial scarcity. This is artificial elastic demand that has been created for an essential product, and people don't seem to trust that it's not in the best interest of everybody involved, even from a purely money-making standpoint, to continue any sort of shortage. It's just not. It's not. It doesn't make sense at all. Yeah, we talked about that earlier, Ace. We talked about that earlier. Variant says, the guys on the base near here are all forgetting to fill their tanks so they can skate. It's honestly funny. That is kind of actually hilarious. Sorry for moving around a little bit. Again, I explained that part of the reason why my audio quality isn't the best is because I'm stuck in my room because I decided to throw my back out in the garden today. But let's talk about what to do for this going on in the future. Because the problem that a lot of us are going to keep running into is, how can we stop panic buying if other people who we can't control, right? Like, let's talk stoicism for a second. There are circles of control. There are things you can control and there are things you can't. And even to some extent, some of the things that the ancient Stoics would have put into your control, like what you think at any given time, might not fully be in your control according to modern neuroscience. So let's teach the simple version of this. Things that are in your control, what you do, and most of what you think. The attitude and judgment that you take about the things that happen around you. Out of your control. Pretty much every damn thing else. And even what you physically do might not be fully in your control. If your body gets bound up, you can't necessarily go walking somewhere if you want to, right? So, talking about what to do in the future, it could be very, very difficult because, as many of you folks mentioned with the toilet paper thing, if a bunch of your friends and neighbors go running on the stores to get toilet paper, gasoline, etc., well, there's not a lot you can do about that. And if you hold back, then you might not be able to get yours. So it's very tempting to go running with the herd. It's the same thing that collapsed the banks, like right before the Great Depression, right? Everybody figured out that some banks were running out of money and then went running on the banks to get theirs before the banks got shut down, and that caused the banks to collapse en masse. But I think there are at least some things we can do to lessen the chance of these sorts of things. One of them is that if a shortage is building up and you happen to have extra of a certain thing, letting friends and family that you trust know that if they run out, you'll be there for them. Being willing to put yourself out there as somebody who's willing to help, that can be very, very helpful. When my husband and I got COVID, my mother-in-law actually went running from store to store with a mask on, of course, looking for toilet paper, and brought it and cough medicine, both of which were restricted, to our house to make sure that we would have it to get through. We almost ran out at the time because we didn't go panic buy like everybody else did. That willingness for them to help when we got stuck in our homes saved us a lot. And now, granted, that's family, mother-in-law, but I did something similar for my friend when she got sick. I went and I got her some cold medicine and some food, I cooked her some homemade soup. That willingness to help each other in times of crises, and our willingness to share on the faith that things will get better, and having that optimism that things will get better, is one of those things we can do to help stop something like this from happening. Now, granted, you can't stop an entire herd of people, but you can influence the people in your life and potentially talk them into influencing each other. Now, granted, there's a certain undercurrent in American politics of selfishness, right? There's entire political parties that are dedicated mostly to selfishness as a virtue. I'm looking at the libertarians over here. And, you've got Ayn Rand in the corner, lots of, angry college frat boys reading her, being like, any sort of altruism is a vice, and it's terrible, and it's what's bringing down society. And you're not ever going to convince them. But most people, instinctively, I think, can be reasoned with. Right? Most people genuinely, if you give them that little bit of security and assurance, that little bit of trust, can be reasoned with. And you never know if your little bit of kindness might change their mind for them to be a little more kind in the future. That whole pass it on idea. Sarana, panic buying happens whenever there's a threat of snow here in Washington because nobody has snow tires. If it's so much as that there's a flake, panic buying happens too. Which, again, one of the other things you can do to avoid your own panic buying is to actually do a sort of slow extra stock up. Not a disaster prep per se, not having an entire week or 2 or 3's worth of food, supplies, etc., and definitely not gas, because again, gas degrades really, really fast. But for most kinds of emergencies, having a few days worth of food and water at the very least, or if you're in an area where getting snowed in is a risk, and you've had power knocked out for a week or 2, whatever the average sort of length of a crisis is, slowly, not panic buying, not all at once, picking up a few extra cans of food, budgeting for that, picking up a little bit of extra toilet paper or something and budgeting for that, a little bit of extra water and budgeting for that, canisters of fuel that can work for a gas burner, a small one. Again, we're talking propane probably, not in your tank gas, and don't put it in a plastic bag. I'm going to reiterate that. The photograph is going to give me nightmares. The photograph in my thumbnail. But, what I'm suggesting here is to slowly build yourself some kind of security for these sorts of situations, and make sure you've got a little bit extra here and there to help other people when they might be in a negative situation. You might not, and I understand if you don't have a lot to give, that's fine. You don't have to. But it is one suggestion, if you do have a little extra here and there, to start building those cycles of reciprocity with people in your lives, with coworkers, with friends, with family. Because building those cycles of reciprocity builds community trust, which means the sort of panic herd mentality will get just that much weaker, with just that small influence. Ikeda, is it latent Christianity that makes people want to prepare for the apocalypse? Thank you so much for the $5 super chat. I don't think it's necessarily, I think it probably plays a part. I don't think every disaster is going to be an apocalypse. I think, honestly, I think somebody hit the nail on the head earlier when they said, I think that living paycheck to paycheck has a lot to do with it. Because it probably does. When you're living in perpetual scarcity and things might get even more expensive, that is an absolutely terrifying, absolutely freaking terrifying idea. 100%. And yeah, latent Christianity, Justin, does probably make people want the apocalypse or at least fantasize about it. But at the minimum, I will say that as much as anything else, trying to build that self-reliance, but not to the exclusion of community, trying to build these community ties where you know that you've got enough food, another person might have enough of other supplies, where you all can work together. That can be helpful. Mutual aid can be massively helpful. And this is much more of a long-term solution for things like panic buying. And again, your tiny network isn't going to make as big of an impact as if you can persuade other folks to start to build more. And you might not even be the leader or the instigator, but you might be able to have an influence on just your small group of people that you know. But even that influence is a drop in the bucket towards change. If you've ever seen what happens when you put a drop or two of food coloring in a massive bucket of water, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see it there. It will make a change immediately. It might not be enough to see it once you stir it in, but that little spot in which it is, those molecules are all still in there. And with another drop and another drop, slowly the color of the water starts to change. And that's kind of how it has to be with culture. And that's kind of how it has to be with leftism. We can't just be screaming at people for being dumb, though as bad as some of us want to. And trust me, I've been there. I've been there. But I also know that showing tends to work a lot better than telling. Variance says, $10 super chat. Thank you so much, Variance. I got a dip, work tomorrow, and I'm in charge of 30 gaggle fucks who can't be on time, so I need my sleep. Also, Apocalypse Fantasy is very military. Fave convo on Watch Bar None. Many 12 seconds spent on it. Many 12 spent on it? I think hardcore preppers generally have some sort of apocalyptic ideology. Most that I've met have either been fundamentalist Christian or Nazi adjacent. Preparativeness is different, but preppers ack. So there's a lot of prepper nonsense. And again, I'm not insulting you, Victoria. I'm not insulting generalized preppers, everybody, but there is a trend in that community toward those sorts of things. This idea of I'll have mine and F you, the idea of being the person who not only predicted it, but was so prepared that you are like everybody else now wants what you have. There's a power fantasy involved in a lot of prepping. Not everybody, but a lot of it. I have a preparedness kit in my home myself that I built over time. I've talked about it before. I can of things here and there. Every so often I'll swap them out if I need them. It helped out a little bit during COVID. But part of the problem is that being prepared for an entire year worth of pandemic or something is not exactly something that most of us even can do, even over time. We are, due to the very nature of the way that we live, especially those of us who live in apartments or small houses in the suburbs or other things, interdependent. We are all reliant on each other. So running off to buy 10 gallons of gasoline and stick them in a plastic bag, or building yourself a fort of toilet paper, ultimately, it's an illusion of security in the first place. And understanding that and helping other people around you understand that, and understand that if you really want to have a proper prep, that what you need to do more than anything is to build networks of people who will work together. That community is ultimately going to be your strength in a situation like that. Especially because even for those of you who've ever watched Apocalypse Fantasies, what happens? A community comes together and they defend things together. There might be a valiant hero, but without the whole community, that valiant hero has nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat. So that sort of interconnectedness is going to be essential. Absolutely. Ikeda says, not like early Christians practice mutualism, heresy. Well, what's interesting is that, like, there is an idea of brotherliness and mutualism, but only among Christians. Like, you know, those dirty pagans, like, we get excluded. We have to find our own mutualism. But the Christians, they're, like, charity is supposed to be built into the structure of the church. Now, granted, a lot of that has died with mega churches and things of that nature, but actually, that is one of the few things that Christianity, for at least a little while, did get right, was the willingness to help the communities of the church. Now, granted, there's a lot to be said about tax-exempt status in the modern day and them refusing to help anybody who doesn't convert, and conversion being the underlying motivation for that charity, right? And taking care of only Christians being an underlying motivation for that charity. And that's a major freaking problem. But it was part of what motivated people to become Christians early on to begin with, were these interconnected networks of people who would support each other. It's one of the things that people say, like, for example, when they come out of far more secluded branches of Christianity, like the Amish branches, that interconnectedness of community, the interreliance, is one of the things that those who don't leave, they say that they need or that they want. Now, I'm not defending that. I'm not defending the over-reliance on this sort of thing and the way that it is tied with, like, damnation narratives and everything else. Like, Christianity has a lot of problems. But I will say, when you're talking about it, you recognizing what people get out of it, this interconnected network of, you know, that so long you're a part of the faith, that these things will be there for you. That's something they have that a lot of people are disconnected from. Or at least it's something that some of them have anyway. And it's something that, as lefties, as folks who understand these things, we can create versions of without having to tie them to religion, necessarily. I mean, we can tie them to religion, but, like, you can have religious justifications for them, but, like, I would never do charity on the grounds that somebody convert from paganism. Like, I might knit socks and things for women's shelters from time to time because of Athena, but I'm not going to be like, you have to be a Hellenist to wear my socks. Like, that's not the way that I am. So, let's see. Haha, finally works. I hope. No point, just money. Yes, also make sure your community is safe to make. I think the left can learn something from Christian evangelism. I did a whole thing on it a while back, but leftist mutual aid is sort of evangelicalism for the left, if you think about it. The thing is, though, is leftist mutual aid doesn't just tend to be limited to leftists. It's just that mostly leftists will contribute to it, whereas people that are further on the right don't see the point. It's not really evangelism. I disagree with that take. Mutual aid is meant to benefit a whole community. It's not necessarily meant to spread lefty ideas per se, though it can do that as an aside. Whereas evangelism is deliberately only to spread Christianity, and the benefits is more used as like a carrot on the stick for that. Mutual aid, the purpose is to help the community, and the spread of lefty ideas is a happy byproduct, more often than not. So, let's see. Talking more about the future, as I said, the gasoline shortage is sort of a manufactured crisis. And for those of you who currently live in states that are heavily affected by it, I am sorry that that is happening. But it looks like Colonial Pipeline has successfully restarted its servers from a backup. So the chances of this lasting for too much longer, much more than a week or so, is pretty low. If you are near a gas station that still has gas, it might be good to top up if you need it or if you're close to needing it. But if you don't think you're going to need to fill up within the next few days, you're probably going to be fine. But I think that events like this, and like the toilet paper shortage and like COVID, they're a good opportunity to talk about things like mutual aid and why people run on certain supplies when there's a risk that it might not be there. As though basic staples are somehow going to disappear. because I think it shows the inherent understanding and distrust for a society in which profit is the primary motivating drive for most interactions. And I think trying to build networks of our own of some kind, even just among those we love, where we know we can rely on each other, where we know that if there is an emergency, I've got a ride to the hospital. Like, if there's an emergency, you know, we know, like, if one of my friends needs me, I will go shopping for them and I will make sure that they have food. To know that we have each other's back and that it's mutual and that it's not just one person taking from the over and over, which is something that people worry about all the time. That's something we can do to help curb this sort of behavior. And it's a very, very long-term, slow solution that requires a lot of cooperation, but you know, that's kind of how humans have existed for most of our existence. Right? There's kind of a reason for that. So it's important, I think, for us as lefties, as folks in my audience, as people who for some reason show up to this channel and believe the tagline when I say we're stronger together, we need to embody that and not just say it. And that means what we can do, we should do. And even more than should, for those of us who can, we must do. Building those sorts of networks and security can make it a lot easier to not run with the crowds, and it also makes those crowds a little bit smaller. And if your network of people happens to have a further network of people, like, this is how job opportunities happen. This is how the rich do it. But they do it with each other and not with us. We recognize those of us who are in the lower classes, because the middle class doesn't fucking exist. There's the upper class and then there's lower classes, and we're all in this together, right? We all live together, as it is said in Warframe. Like, those of us who know what it is to go hungry, or to go without gas, or to not have enough money to make it to your next rent check. Those of us who know what it's like to have our power shut down. We can help each other. That's what mutual aid is about. And if we're all too scared to actually do that, if we're all looking for some sort of organization of it rather than just even simply putting out those tendrils ourselves into our communities, if we're all too scared to do that, then change will never be made, because we'll be perpetuating inadvertently the exact system that we're fighting against. The exact fear that leads to the inherent instability of a capitalist system. So I don't know necessarily if that is helpful for all of you. I don't know if this message is inspiring or frustrating, but it shows that mutual aid is needed now more than ever, that we keep having over and over and over again these crises. When even the most basic of mutual aid networks and care that we could put into them would have prevented something like this. Trust in the institutions which care for us, trust in the institutions of both government and the supply chains and things. The fact that that trust has been eroded so heavily that you get these manufactured crises says something. And if we want them to stop happening, or at least be a little bit less frequent, we've got to do something ourselves. And that something starts with, if you get sick, I'll take you to the hospital. If you can't leave your house, I'll bring you food. And something as simple and small as that can grow into a movement. And it can grow into a shift in culture and trust and community that some of us have known for a long time and others are just now discovering. But we have to reject this idea that if I've got mine, you can't have yours. Because otherwise, We ain't got any hope of getting out of this. And these crises are going to come harder and faster and more frequently, especially as climate change makes everything worse. Building these networks and foundations now will lay the groundwork for the future. So, those are my thoughts on the crisis. Do you guys have any questions? Is there any sort of anything more that you want to know about the actual crisis itself, or anything else that, like, I missed? Anything that you want me to talk about? Hey, Russ. And this is, like, especially with the pandemic, people have been going back to getting new skills and things. Like, I talked about the knitting tea party, so to speak. Learning how to make your own garments and things, that can help a lot. Especially if you end up, as any knitter does, as a yarn hoarder, you're probably going to have enough material to keep yourself pretty busy if you get locked in with a snowstorm. But as Victoria said, the resources exist. We cannot afford to hide them behind finances. And even beyond that, the way to create a cycle of reciprocity is to be willing to give in the first place. You know, reciprocity is I give because you gave, I give because I know you will give. I give merely out of the kindness of my heart, knowing one day you will too. The point is the gift. And as mostly pagans, we understand this when it comes with the gods. We need to start treating other people the same way. That's my viewpoint on this. I didn't need to buy yarn last year. I'm calling myself out there, Rilla. Yeah, that you know about, Lizzie. That you know about. And Casper's like, yep, Lascara is sitting there going, yeah, that's me too. So, again, that's kind of where I'm at. That's most of my thoughts on this. I hope that I gave you guys at least a little bit of comfort in an extremely stressful time, I know for many people. But it's looking like we're going to pull out of this within the next few days. But I think this is the time where we're going to need to keep on with these discussions, because as we're being called for returns to quote-unquote normalcy, well, we're living in a new normal, and we can create a better normal. And I think that stuff like this is going to be the start. I think that stuff like this is going to be the start. So here's where we're at. Those are my thoughts. Ikeda says, best wishes for Jen. I hope she feels better, even if she does not post for a while. Jen is still undergoing testing and things. When she's ready to share what she's finding out, she will. But Jen is on hiatus, and there's nothing going on between the two of us. We still talk every day. We're just making sure that she's okay. Like, she's focusing on her health, and more power to her. Always. Rilla says, all my yarn fits in one room. And what you mean by that is, but when you open the door, sometimes it doesn't fall on you. So, but I think that the one thing that I will give preppers is that, yes, they're prepared for themselves, but most of the time they're not really all that concerned for the wider community, which I'm not saying that about you, Victoria. But a lot of the time, this idea of taking care of myself first doesn't extend to the wider community, and that's the failing of that attitude. And that will always be the failing of that attitude. Because a life without the ones you love isn't really worth living, is it? And as much as we hope that people will help us in our time of need, we often don't give as much thought as we could to making it clear that we would help them too. So, my biggest thought in all of this is we can either take this as paralysis and fear, the way that so many people have, and create these issues over and over and over again, or we can take this as an opportunity to try to create a normal that's a little closer to the world that we want to live in. And even if that isn't going to create systemic change right away, it can increase the quality of our lives and those of those that we network with and that we love. And that's what's most important, I think. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I noticed that maybe my screen's just not updating, but I only see like, what, 3 likes? Oh no, there's 55 of them. There's 58 people watching. There's 55 likes. If you guys haven't gotten a chance to do that, please check that out. Also, get into the chill portion of the stream. I did another really, really emotional video this week. And if the responses of my patrons are anything to go by, it was an important one. My patrons asked me to make a video about my daily practices as a Hellenist. And I realized that the reason I was procrastinating doing that script for 3 days was because I had a lot of insecurities around even calling practices that, because of my limitations, might not be daily. And it got me thinking about this insecurity that so many of us feel about whether or not we are doing enough for our faiths, our communities, and the gods. So I decided to talk about that. And I decided to talk about that in a way that I have not seen done in the community before. I decided to talk about not only the fact that those feelings may be unfounded for a good chunk of us, but also that the why behind them, where they come from. Because much like when you go into a doctor's office, you can treat the symptoms, but if you don't find the disease, then they're just going to keep recurring. It's the same when it comes to certain attitudes in mental health. One of the things you learn in cognitive behavioral therapy is that if you discover what belief is causing your problems, then by rooting that out, you can then stop a lot of problematic thought and behavior. So this week I made a video about, are you doing enough for the gods? That's the title. And we're going to have a conversation as a community about that. And I actually cannot wait to see what you guys think in the comments of that video and in the live chat, because it's intense, it's difficult, and I get very personal in that video. So I'm looking forward to seeing if that was worth it, because being that vulnerable for an audience, knowing that Folkists in particular are going to take that as ammo, was very, very hard. But I'm hoping that it was worth it. So another thing is that I have decided to finally bite the bullet and start an Instagram. People have been nagging me to do that for a little while. It's in the description of this video. It will be in all of the descriptions of all of my videos going forward. But I've started an Instagram. Expect knitting pictures and food porn and any number of other crazy things. I might post thumbnails from time to time and start discussions on topics prior to releasing videos. I might just decide to kind of post about something that's been on my mind that I don't think is enough for a script, but it's a discussion I want for the community. If you guys want to see what's going on in my crazy brain, and maybe some pictures that I take here and there when I go on walks and stuff, or when I make pretty things, food or knitting otherwise, check out my Instagram. It doesn't have a lot of followers on it yet. I've only got a few pictures. I posted the gloves that I made for my partner and some dinners that I made, including a recipe. It's very basic, but I'm trying it out. We're going to see where it goes. It's better than my Twitter, at least, which is always on fire. And yeah, those are the big things that are happening. Thank you guys again. There's over 50 of you that stuck it through this whole video, and I'm super, super appreciative. That helps the algorithm so much. If you all want to stick around, especially if you're watching the VOD, and let me know in the comments, what do you think about the idea of sort of building maybe not even official mutual aid organization networks, but even just interconnected networks of those you trust and care about, and how that can shift the cultural narrative and maybe even change minds away from doing things like rushing to the gas stations. If you are living in the Southeast and you're being affected by this, I want to hear your stories in the comments also. If you have been showing up to gas stations, if you've seen people putting shit in bags, tell me all your horror stories and tell me how you've been getting through it and what you've decided. If you want to confess that you happen to be one of the people who hoarded the gas, I won't judge you, but I'll be very interested to see why. Tell me why you did it. But I would absolutely love to hear from you. Mason Munn, I'm glad that you enjoyed my videos on Woo. I tend to try to avoid getting too deep into drama in the community unless I feel like I need to get involved, but In the case of him and Freya Norling both, I felt like I needed to say something, especially because people were definitely asking me to. Like, I was getting pressured pretty heavily for both of those by the community to speak out. Especially with the Wisdom of Odin, when I had one of his victims come to me. Like, I couldn't stay quiet about that. So, anyhow, thank you guys again for sticking through that. As always, I'm going to remind you guys, we are stronger together. Have a great rest of your evening.